Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles 24/8. I'm Allison.
And I'm Erica. And before we start, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, or stream us on Spotify and on YouTube. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter/X, and TikTok too. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. What's up?
Hey, I'm good. Celebrating a bunch of happy Beatles events this weekend. The anniversary of when John met Paul is a fun one. And
Yes.
of course, happy birthday to Ringo.
Yeah, we got a whole big Ringo episode today, which is really exciting. So we haven't done one on Ringo in a while, in a hot minute.
I know. It was a great weekend to do it, especially because for the past couple of years, including this weekend, you've been at Ringo's birthday party.
Yes, I've been so lucky. Oh my God. It's a highlight of my year every year. And thank you, Ringo, for being born, number one. Number two, having these amazing soirees in Beverly Hills near his, I don't know if you guys know, but he's got the statue. I think he did it himself. He donated it to the city of Beverly Hills, but it's his hand doing the peace symbol. I don't even know what it's made out of, but it's like a silver metallic, huge sculpture. But he has his little birthday party there every year. And he's always got a bunch of guests, and there's music, and there's food, and there's cake. And so the last couple of years, I've been lucky enough to be on the media line. So it's been really fun. And that was on Sunday. So just a few days ago.
Tell us about meeting Ringo.
That happened last year. So yeah, let's throw it back to last year when I was on the media line, and dream of all dreams, I got to interview Ringo for a hot second, and he is always just bombarded on these media lines. There's so many people to talk to. He does such a great job at navigating it. And he stopped and we chatted for a second. And rather than me telling you about it, why don't we just play the clip? Hi, Ringo. Very nice to meet you. Peace and love.
Thank you. Peace and love.
I'm from a podcast called BC the Beatles.
Oh, the podcast. Yeah.
Wanted to ask you one simple question. Paul posted a photo today.
Oh, did he?
He did, with a cute little dog in it. And you. And I just wanted to know, it's like a little, maybe like a golden doodle puppy, perhaps? But I wanted to know, is that your dog?
No.
And-
No, it's not my dog.
Or do you have any dogs?
We have
What are
a
their
rescue
names?
dog here. We lost two of our dogs last year.
Oh, no.
And,
I know on Ringo Rama you referenced Buster and Monty, right?
yeah, well,
They're probably...
Buster loved music, but he's well gone.
Yeah.
And,
Thank you so
he would
much.
sit under the drums.
Oh, really? That's so
For a
funny.
dog.
For a dog who's
Yeah.
afraid of, like, fireworks and stuff,
And if
right?
you listen closely to the record we made in those days,
Yeah.
or I made, you'll hear barking.
As you can see, we get to the important topics.
Yes, exactly. And we've always said, if Paul were to ever come on the podcast, of course, we talked about the Beatles, whatever, blah, 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 blah. But we want to know all about his dogs. And
Yes.
I'd like to know about his kitties. He's had cats over the years. And we just need to know his situation with Rose, his dog, and
I know.
any other
And
dogs.
Jet.
Jet. Oh, yes, Jet. That's right.
That was big news last year, a dog named Jet.
Yes. And, we know that Nancy's son, I believe, has dogs that they watch from time to time. We just need to know all about these dogs, like the dog situation.
We are the place for the hard-hitting Beatle animal news.
Obviously, yes. This is why you listen to this podcast, because we get right to the heart of the matter here.
Yes, but Ringo did tell an adorable story in your interview that I'd never heard before about
I
his
know.
dog loving the drums. Oh my God.
I know. And I was so surprised, like I said to him, I was like, you never hear that because usually dogs are terrified, but Buster really enjoyed it. So good for him. He was truly a daddy's dog.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
We actually have the video of this as well. Right now it's on YouTube as a short and it's on TikTok. So if you'd like to see Allison and Ringo talking dogs in real time on video, go check that out.
Yeah, it was definitely a highlight of my life, highlight of my Beatles fandom for sure. I'm still pinching myself. Let's just put it that way. It was a wonderful moment, and I'm so appreciative and feel so hashtag blessed.
Mm. Anyway, happy birthday, Ringo.
Yes, happy birthday.
We can't wait till next year. Next year, we're both going to go.
Yes, we are. You have to come out for it.
Yes, I've never been to that event. It looks like an amazing event. I love that silver peace sign, that gigantic life size. Like it's bigger
So
than Ringo. He
crazy.
stands next to it and it's huge.
It's so, and I got to tell you, so obviously the event is always in July and it's always super freaking hot. And past years I've posted on our socials because I always get really, really sunburnt at this event. This year I didn't because I wore 100 plus SPF sunscreen, and I highly recommend it to any of my pale folks out there. It works really well. But I always forget that that stupid sculpture is 100,000 degrees. And so
Oh
I
no.
always take a photo with it, and I always inevitably put my hand like right on it, and it just blazing hot, just burns the shit right off my hand. But
Oh
it was
shit.
but it was okay. It was, it's a knee jerk reaction, but then you're fine.
I'm
It wakes you up. It's great. It's
I'm
refreshing, really.
doing it for Ringo.
Definitely pays to drink some water, bring a little portable fan, and try to stay cool. This year in the line, there were some people with umbrellas, which I was very, very grateful for.
Yeah, being outside in the direct sun for hours. It sounds like a hiking trip to me, just with Ringo
Yeah,
and cake,
with more Ringo and more cake. Yes,
which are both great things to have on any hiking trip.
yeah, essentials really.
Hmm. Hmm. So yeah,
Anyway,
go check that out. Go check out our first interview with Beetle, I would think.
our
Yeah,
first, hopefully not our last.
definitely not our last. We're looking at you, Paul.
And obviously, if Ringo ever wants to come back, we would love to have you.
We have more dog questions, many,
Yeah,
many
we can
more.
definitely dig up more animal related questions, and we'll ask you about I mean, I would ask you anything about Ringo Rama because that's my guilty pleasure Ringo album.
Hey, Ringo Rama's a great album. That
Um,
was what the story was from too, that he told us.
exactly. And that's what I pulled it from because I love that freaking album so much.
That is great. Well, today,
Speaking of Ringo albums,
yes, we're not going to talk about Ringo Rama, but we're going to talk about Ringo, the Ringo album, which to me is the closest thing we ever got to an actual Beatles reunion.
I think it's my favorite Ringo album. Yeah, what about you, Erica?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And probably for a lot of the reasons that we're going to talk about today. Though I really did like Postcards from Paradise, which is like 2015, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I forget what year that came out. That was a good album. It's a good album. Solid.
Yeah. And maybe our new favorite album will be his next country album, which is the next thing he's planning.
Yes, I'm here for it. If you like Boo Coop's Blues,
Yeah.
which was not a bad album either.
Yeah. And that's almost where we're going to start. We're going to go back a little bit further and talk first about what led up to the Ringo album. We all know in 1970, the Beatles broke up extremely acrimoniously, especially when we're talking about Paul versus the other three, mostly because Paul wanted his new father in law, Lee Eastman, to manage the Beatles' money, where the other three were enchanted by the magic of Alan Klein. And Alan Klein won out, and there was a huge rift. But despite that, if we're not talking about Paul, in the early 1970s, collaborations were pretty common still between some of the former Beatles. Most often, George and Ringo, they worked together on nearly all of George's solo output. Ringo was part of it, including All Things Must Pass, the concert for Bangladesh, and Living in the Material World. As for John, he also collaborated with both George and Ringo in his early solo career. George worked with John on the Sometime in New York City album, on Imagine, and on Yoko's Plastic Ono Band album. And Ringo also worked with Yoko on that album and on John's Plastic Ono Band album. And he had the pleasure, I guess, of participating in John and Yoko's experimental album Fly, which is
Fly, which
interesting.
was also a video, right?
A
Fly was a movie
very,
they made.
yeah, a really creepy movie where they had a close up of a fly crawling all over a still woman on a bed.
Yes, yes. We were chatting with May Pang, I don't know, maybe about a month ago on this podcast. And in her book, she talks about being there for the making of Fly and how many flies they had to go through to make that movie. And seeing the footage, it just makes your skin crawl.
I do not like bugs. It freaks me out.
Yeah, no, and flies are dirty and
Yeah.
gross. Yeah.
Mhm.
Anyway, I digress.
So that's really where we are with the collaborations in the early 70s. In those early post-breakup years, nobody worked with Paul. And before somebody actually's me on this, yes, Paul did arrange one song for Ringo's first album, Sentimental Journey, but that was all done before the Beatles broke up, doesn't count. But those years right after the Beatles broke up were especially contentious between John and Paul with the Alan Klein issue. And the other two Beatles were taking John's side. They were with Alan Klein. There were no occasions where more than two Beatles were collaborating at the same time. That changed with Ringo's 1973 album called Ringo. That was the only solo Beatle album that included both new compositions and performances by all four ex-Beatles. The Ringo album was actually Ringo's third album, but it was his first rock album because his first solo record was called Sentimental Journey. It's a collection of standards, and Ringo conceived of this project in the fall of 1969, right after John privately stated his intention to leave the Beatles, that he wanted a divorce that September. The song choices were from his childhood, designed to please his mother, which is
Aw.
adorable. In
Aw.
fact, his original idea was to have his stepfather do the singing for
Oh,
his
really?
mother. Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's so
But
interesting.
he wasn't a singer and it didn't work out, so Ringo ended up stepping in. That was the original intention, which is adorable.
Oh, I love Ringo's love for his mom and his stepfather.
I know.
What a
I
sweet little
know.
family.
Yeah. Originally, the album was supposed to be called Ringo Stardust, and I think they made a grave mistake to not keep that name. I love that name.
Well, that's my drag name. So
Oh, good. I'm Miss Kisses on the bottom. You're Ringo Stardust. I'm happy. I love this so much.
This is great. Oh yeah. Miss Kisses on the bottom, as you'll forever be known.
That's a choice, though. It's a choice.
It's a choice.
So, Ringo Stardust or Sentimental Journey was released on March 27th, 1970. That date might perk your ears up a little bit because, as we all know, the Beatles' breakup was in April of 1970, and the catalyst was the release of Paul's first solo album, McCartney. There was a big fight, actually, between Ringo and Paul because the three other Beatles, well, John and George actually really wanted Paul to delay the release of his solo album to make way for both Sentimental Journey and for Let It Be, which hasn't come out yet. And so they wrote the letter. And then Ringo brought this letter to Paul at his house in Cavendish, asking him to delay the release. And Paul and Ringo got into a huge argument. Paul was so pissed. According to Ringo, Paul, quote unquote, went crazy and he threatened, "I'll finish you now, you'll pay," which is hilarious thinking about Paul saying that. I
To
couldn't imagine.
Ringo, of all people.
Like, I keep going back to that scene in A Hard Day's Night where he gets mad at somebody for losing his grandfather. He's like, "I'll cripple you."
Oh, cripple, yeah. Oh my gosh.
He looks
That's
like
totally
that.
the vibe. Yeah, I can't believe he's screaming this at Ringo of all people. Ringo, who is like Switzerland in the Beatles, you
It
know,
really shook him
all
up.
these years. It's like, this doesn't happen to Ringo. This happens to like John and Paul. You know, even George sometimes gets in on it, but Ringo is like not that guy.
No, and he's the one, like, when Ringo's starting to get into it, things are bad.
Yeah, that's a very bad harbinger.
And Paul, in addition to being mad at Ringo, decided that they could all go fuck off. And so he did not delay the album. It went out on April 17th, along with the delightfully passive-aggressive Q&A between Paul and Paul in the McCartney album liner notes that basically announces the Beatles' breakup.
So bitchy.
Yeah, he doubled down.
He sure did. He really did double down.
And
Oh my God.
whether or not as a result of that, Sentimental Journey's reception was middling. I mean, some people perceived it as distasteful, like Ringo was trying to launch a solo career on the coattails of the Beatles breakup and all the drama. Some people just didn't like the record. In 1970, John said in a Rolling Stone article that he was embarrassed by it. But in a shocking twist worthy of an M. Night Shyamalan movie, George, who's usually the one bringing the shade, called it, quote, a great album and, quote, really nice.
Do we think he was sincere or was this sarcastic?
I think that he and Ringo were very close, and I think they were buddies. Whatever he thought of the actual album, I think that he was 100% sincerely on Ringo's side.
It was like a united front kind of thing. Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right on that.
Paul? Well, he released the McCartney album, and that's all we can say about that.
So petty. So petty.
So petty. Ringo himself was happy with the album, if for no other reason than it kept him in the habit of recording during a very stressful and uncertain time. He even briefly considered taking it to Vegas to do like a hotel residency like Elvis was doing at that time. But ultimately, he decided not to become a lounge lizard, unfortunately, because I think he would have
I could see
made
that for him.
a perfect 1970s lounge lizard.
Yes. I love it. I can see him through the cigarette smoke now with the sparkling noise of casino slot machines behind him. Oh, heaven.
The album itself charted at number 7 in the UK, number 22 in the US. Not terrible. And it started a trend of pop stars doing big band or standards albums, like Harry Nilsson did one. Linda Ronstadt has an amazing, famous one. And of course, later, Paul McCartney with, of course, Kisses on the Bottom.
Yes, Miss Kisses. Miss Kisses on the bottom.
If I ever do interview Paul McCartney, I'm going to tell him that.
Yeah. Be like, you know what an internet troll said about me one time? That I then co-opted and took back and owned it.
And it's my favorite thing ever. So back to Ringo. Sentimental Journey was quickly followed by his second album, Bokus of Blues, which is a country album released in September of 1970. This was produced on a super fast timetable. The songs were written for Ringo by country writers over a 2 to 3 week period. It was almost like on a dare, like I bet you can't. And like he had friends and like, I bet we can. And we do. And we did. And then Ringo recorded the whole album over 3 days down in Nashville.
Speed recording.
Both of these albums were essentially novelty projects. Neither of them, I think, because of that, did amazingly. But Ringo came back to rock music in a really big way in April of 1971 with his first rock single, It Don't Come Easy. So this one is credited to Ringo, but it was with George's uncredited help. It was produced by George, who also played guitar on it, and they had Klaus Voormann on bass. And according to Ringo, George wanted to incorporate a lot more references to Hare Krishna. And although there is a brief backing vocal of Hare Krishna, Ringo steered him to the topic of peace instead. So maybe that was the beginning of Ringo's obsession with peace and love.
Oh, absolutely. But I do think this is the first time on record that we hear Ringo say, peace is how we make it in the lyrics of It Don't Come Easy.
Yeah. And he said it a lot over the years because this hit the top 5 on most charts worldwide. And at the time, it outsold all the other Beatles singles to date.
God damn.
God damn it, Ringo. He's been singing this a lot ever since because it's become one of his signature songs.
I mean, it's a banger, though.
It's a great song. It's a great fucking song. Yeah.
It is a great. Every time it comes on, like my shuffle or something, I'm like, fuck yeah, turn that shit up. Like, that is a never skip song for me.
Hell yeah. And he followed strength with strength. The next year, he released another single, Back Off Boogaloo, which is an awesome song.
Another great bop.
Oh, so good. Same general personnel, again, written by Ringo with an assist by George that was uncredited until 2017. Also produced by George, also played guitar with Klaus on bass. This was also, again, a critical success, top 10 hit in the UK, US, Canada, Sweden, and the Netherlands, and hit the top 20 in most other worldwide charts. So yeah, Ringo's going great here.
Yeah, definitely rebounding from his first 2 albums.
Yeah. The only odd thing is that neither of these singles were attached to an album, to plans for an album, to plans for an album that led to a tour. Like there was nothing more. They were just two standalone things. And Ringo himself kind of didn't want to. He decided he would rather concentrate on his acting, didn't want to do the full album at the moment. So an album project didn't really materialize until a year later with a whole new endeavor, which became this Ringo album in 1973. So before we get into the Ringo album, let's just look at what the Beatles were doing up till 1973 and where we find our friends at this time. So George had been thriving as a solo artist after his masterpiece, All Things Must Pass, was released. He then focused on the Concert for Bangladesh. The Concert for Bangladesh became the blueprint for all large-scale concert fundraisers to come. And in addition to the two-night event itself at Madison Square Garden in New York City, it also produced a best-selling live album, a 3-disc box set, and a documentary which played in movie theaters in the spring of 1972. Now, Ringo was a part of Bangladesh, but George did ask all 3 of his former Beatles bandmates to participate. Paul got super weird about it. Paul first said he would do it. Yeah, I know. He would do it, but only if John was also performing. But John had to be doing his own set. And then Paul backed out, citing too many legal difficulties to be on the same stage together yet, even if they were just doing separate sets at different times. So Paul, no way. John, at the beginning, was more enthusiastic about it until George told him only he was invited, not Yoko. He didn't have enough biscuits to go around.
Big mistake. Huge.
Yeah. So then John and Yoko fought about it. Everybody was fighting and everybody was mad. And John ended up flying alone to Paris that day and skipped the event altogether. No, John. After the Concert for Bangladesh, Living in the Material World was released in May of 1973. That held the top spot in the charts for 5 weeks. So George was still soaring high. He had a great post-Beatles run. John, however, well, his life was pretty up and down. He was kind of going through it. His last album, Sometime in New York City, was not well received, mostly due to the heavy political content. And that one single in particular had very little radio play. You know, that one, many DJs.
That one little juicy song that...
yeah, the one DJs wouldn't play because, you know, the title has the N-word in it.
Oh, just the N-word. Like, that's... Wow.
I can't believe anybody played it. Like, even in 1973, I cannot believe anybody played it.
It's so cringe, as the kids would say.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, John. I mean, and I loved it. I love like reading interviews where he tries to defend it and like justify it. Be like, no, but it's saying that she's abused and all this. But it's like, John, but you don't have to say you don't have to say the N-word though. You know that.
Just don't. Please don't.
Yeah. Like I don't care what your intentions are. Like, come on, just put it away. Don't say it. Don't trot it out.
Yep. Creatively, though, he had put that behind him and was on an upswing with the recording of Mind Games in New York City during that time. But not everything was rosy. He was also having increased trouble with his immigration status. For that, see our Utopia episode from a few months ago. And after he got that settled, more or less, his relationship with Yoko was deteriorating to the point that Yoko asked John to leave and then engineered that he take their assistant, May Pang, with him. And see our interview with May from last month for more information on that. The Beatles themselves were still in the middle of messy lawsuits from the breakup. And though John and Paul were past the phase of writing passive-aggressive songs about one another, they weren't like friends yet. So that was still very tense. However, John, George, and Ringo had become very disenchanted with their choice of manager in Alan Klein, which opened the door to some friendlier relations. Not necessarily totally friendly. I think, as Ringo put it, we didn't like Alan Klein, but it didn't mean we were on board with his choice. So there was still some tension about everything, and nothing could be undone at that point. So it was still kind of some open wounds there. And as for Paul was starting to ride a wave of successes with Wings that would make him one of the top selling rock artists of all time outside of the Beatles. His single My Love from the Red Rose Speedway album was critically acclaimed. And then soon after, he had a massive hit in the song Live and Let Die. He would record his mega hit album Band on the Run in 1973, which would be released just 4 weeks after this Ringo album.
Amazing timing choice.
I know.
Can't let Ringo have anything nice.
Oh, Paul. Though the initial anger over the Beatles' breakup had cooled, I mean, his song Dear Friend from the Wildlife album was written for John and seen as a public reconciliation of sorts. Paul was staying far the fuck away from any direct collaborations with other Beatles or with playing Beatles music in public or anything like that. No nostalgia for Paul. Moving forward.
Forward thinking.
Yes. And it was at this moment in the spring of 1973 that production on the Ringo album began. And this was not that well planned. Ringo himself once described this album as, quote, an accidental album. Wasn't totally a planned thing. He was in Nashville for the Grammy Awards because Concert for Bangladesh was nominated and won the 1972 Best Album Grammy. So he scheduled a recording session with famed producer Richard Perry when he was in the States, just to have like an excuse for being there, really.
Very nice.
Yeah. And the project kind of snowballed from there. And the Ringo album, kind of like his two other songs, became a blueprint for most of his projects, as cliched as it sounds and how hard it is for me to say this. Ringo really does get by with a little help from his friends. Ugh. Okay.
It's true, though. It's true. I'll let that slide because it is true.
Yeah. I mean, he's a drummer, right? So no matter how amazing you are as a drummer, it is kind of hard for a drummer to make a solo album. And Ringo had been writing a lot more of his own songs. I think he wanted and needed contributions from others. And most importantly, I think this is where Ringo thrives. I mean, look at his birthday parties. Like he just wants to be part of a huge group of friends, having fun, making music together. And that is what the spirit of this album really is. So when in early 1973, Ringo put out a call to his friends that he wanted to make a rock album and he wanted some collabs, lots of people answered the call. Some of this group included Billy Preston, Harry Nilsson, Jim Keltner, and Martha Reeves, an exciting group of people on their own. But of course, the most fascinating part of this album is the extent of Beatles collaboration on this one record. It is the most complete post-Beatles collaboration that exists if you look at the album as a whole.
And I don't think that anybody could have pulled it off except for Ringo.
No.
Especially at this time.
George tried, and you saw what happened with that, with inviting them all to the concert for Bangladesh.
It didn't really go so well for George, but Ringo, that's another story.
Yeah. And George, of course, was the primary collaborator. He'd been Ringo's regular musical partner for years. And you can even see them as far back as in the Let It Be film, writing Octopus's Garden together. What a cute little scene that was.
I love that.
So it's no surprise that George had the largest contribution to this album. And we'll start with what might be Ringo's most popular song ever, Photograph, was actually credited to Harrison Starkey. And
Take that, Lennon McCartney.
I know, finally.
Shove that in your pipe and smoke it.
And after Ringo kind of left George off as a co-collaborator on the last two singles until 2017 for one of them and never for the other, I'm glad that this one had
finally
the dual writing credit from the beginning. And this song was not written for this album. It was actually written in 1971 in one of the craziest, like, rich people doing rich people things environment I've ever heard about. So they wrote this song on a luxury yacht in the south of France.
Oh
Ringo,
my, how she.
I know. Ringo had chartered the yacht for the Cannes Film Festival just after he and Mo attended Mick Jagger's wedding in Saint-Tropez. They were later joined in France by George and Patty for the Monaco Grand Prix. What?
Oh my gosh, a long way from Liverpool we have come.
This is like the height of 70s decadence. I can just see like the oysters and the like fruit in aspic sitting on all their plates.
Oh my God, an aspic. I love it. Everything's an aspic.
It was a classy affair.
They're all dripping in gold chains and blinding white linen.
They're tans. They're tans. Oh my
tans.
God, they're tans.
Oh God. They're all glistening in the sun. And then this beautiful song is born from that.
Yes. And speaking of folks from Liverpool, our girl Scylla was also on this crazy vacation.
Scylla.
She said that George and Ringo had played them an early version of Photograph for everyone on the yacht that one night. And she recalled that members of their audience were shouting out possible alternate lyrics. That must have been a fun time, considering all of the musicians on this
all
boat.
the musical masterminds. Yes.
Scylla had also recalled in her autobiography that she had wanted the song for herself. But Ringo said no, telling her, "No, it's too bloody good for you. I'm having it myself."
Sorry, Scylla. That's like when Billy J. Kramer asked for "I Want to Hold Your Hand" from John and Paul.
Oh my God.
And John said, "No, I think we're going to keep that one."
They know what's going to be a hit.
They've got the ear. They got the ear for it.
This was not the extent of George's collaboration. He also wrote 2 other songs in the album. The first, "Sunshine Light for Me," "Sail Away Raymond." That song, also written in 1971. It was written soon after the London High Court officially ruled on the dissolution of the Beatles as a business entity. In another Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous moment, George wrote it in Ireland while staying with his friend Donovan. That sounds more my speed. I would enjoy that one. The lyrics fantasize about escaping from modern life to be in nature. That feels like a George theme. But also we have the Sail Away Raymond part of it, and the Raymond, who is name checked in the title, was a lawyer hired by Alan Klein to represent George, John, Ringo, and Apple in that same high court lawsuit that was recently ruled upon, which, by the way, was brought by Paul McCartney. So there's some angst there.
Again, there's Paul.
Yeah.
And then there's Paul.
And then there's Paul on his own over there. And finally, he also co-wrote the last song on the album, "You and Me, Babe." But this time, his co-writer was none other than Beatles roadie and Anvil man, Mal Evans.
Aw, yay. And you guys, at like a lot of little tidbits in this episode, we have an episode on Mal Evans as well. So you can go listen to that and learn a little bit more about Mal if you don't know much about him.
Yeah, with the author of his biography, Ken Womack, and Mal's own son, Gary. So it was a great time. Throughout the Beatles' career, Mal did help out with lyrics here and there and everywhere, though he was uncredited. I say that because that was one of the songs he claims to have written or helped write.
That's a real deep Beatles tidbit there, Erica. You should have a Beatles podcast and talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I should. Super nerd.
And share your historical prowess with everyone.
Maybe I will. Good
idea.
But Mal himself, the whole time, he fancied himself something of a poet and a songwriter. And in the 70s, he was exploring a career on his own as a producer, occasional songwriter. And at this point in his life, Mal was living with George at Friar Park, and he brought him some lyrics for something he called a meditation song. And George reworked it into the song that we have. Now, this is the last song on the album. It serves as a closer for the record, sort of like the end of the night after an evening of entertainment out at a nightclub. It also gave Ringo the chance to personally thank many of the people who helped him make the album, including all 3 Beatles. Rolling Stone's review of the Ringo album called this song infectious and listed it as one of the album's 3 most wonderful songs, along with Photograph and the next song and the next collaboration that we're going to talk about, John Lennon's "I'm the Greatest."
One of the greatest songs on the album.
I know. And unlike the other collaborations, this song wasn't originally meant for Ringo at all. John wrote it for himself in 1970 after watching, this is so crazy, after watching the first UK television broadcast of A Hard Day's Night. Peter Doggett, who wrote the book You Never Give Me Your Money, The Battle for the Soul of the Beatles, that is the encyclopedia about this time period. It's incredible. He opined that John, after seeing himself on TV in this film in black and white, quote, felt like a postcard from the previous century. There he was acting out the role that had become his life. Also, the broadcast of A Hard Day's Night came out just a week after Paul sued the Beatles. So it's not a stretch to think that maybe John was spending a lot more time ruminating on the past at that very moment. And the song was meant to be sarcastic, and I'm the Greatest was taken from Muhammad Ali's catchphrase. Of course, Muhammad Ali, who, when he was still Cassius Clay, met the Beatles in a very famous photo op just around the time of A Hard Day's Night. So it all comes full circle. John Lennon's original demo from 1970, it has the same core lyrics, but it's much different. It feels much slower. It's like a little bluesier. When you listen to it side by side with Ringo, it's very similar to when Revolver came out and we all heard John's original Yellow Submarine demo. So
yeah,
it was just like naked, soulful version of the song that became like a Ringo barn burner, you know? It's just so interesting to see what John's original vision for both of those songs were.
yeah, because Ringo, I think the word bombastic really kind of encapsulates what Ringo's version is. And especially with the title, like I'm the Greatest, listening to John's demo, thinking of it in the same context as that Yellow Submarine demo, like, damn, that's really a stark contrast.
If you think about it in the way that Peter Doggett was talking about it too, that he was looking at this version of himself as this caricature of who he was as a Beatle on this movie in black and white, like he was really feeling something deep. John obviously never recorded this song because he knew how it would actually look. There's no amount of soulfulness that would allow John to sing, I am the greatest, without getting a lot of shit from the media and his fans.
But the thing too, it's like, you know, with Ringo, he could actually be sincere and he sounds very sincere when he sings it, but you don't look at him and say, oh, he's an arrogant fuck. You know, it's like, oh, Ringo singing about how he's the greatest. That's okay.
Yeah, and that's actually what John said. He said in a 1980 interview, quote, I couldn't sing it, but it was perfect for Ringo. He could say, I'm the greatest, and people wouldn't get upset. Whereas if I said I'm the greatest, they'd all take it so seriously.
Oh, absolutely. John was 100% correct in that.
Yes. And he had a lot of fun with it. He rewrote some of the lyrics to suit Ringo's backstory. You know, the lines about him, Billy Shears, all I want to do is boogaloo. The part about his wife and kids was actually a contribution from Yoko. She helped out as well.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's so
cute. Everybody was pitching in to help out Ringo. And so the recording session, this famous recording session with three Beatles took place in LA on March 13th of 1973 with Richard Perry producing. It was originally just supposed to be John and Ringo, but George happened to be in LA for like Beatles business meetings, and he called the studio. When he heard what was happening, he immediately asked if he could come join. And of course, Ringo and John immediately said yes, and John apparently adding, hell yes, tell him to get down here right away and help me finish writing this bridge.
Oh, that's sweet that John's saying that about George.
He said a lot of not great stuff in the flower pot conversations not too many years before. So
that's true. That's true. Water under the bridge.
Yeah, George was fucking killing it. He had nothing to say about George after the last 3 years of George's career, though.
That is true. You couldn't tell George shit at this point.
No way. And so that was it. That was the first time three Beatles were recording together again. And Richard Perry, who, I mean, he's worked with everybody, Elton John, Pointer Sisters, like the list of people he's worked with is legendary. He was amazed at what he saw. He described the atmosphere once George joined them as quote unquote magic. He says, quote, just like that, no planning, the three ex-Beatles recorded one of John's songs. Everyone in the room was just gleaming. It's such a universal gleam with the Beatles.
I just got goosebumps.
I know.
Thinking about that.
I know. And in 1977, Ringo put it in a slightly different way. He said, quote, we were like big girls again. We hadn't played together for 4 years. We were just smiling while we were playing. It was nice.
It was nice. Yeah, it's just cash for Ringo, but, you know, for an outside observer, it's like, oh my God, it's like seeing, you know, like Bigfoot or like something that is so rare and so mythical.
Seriously, and you have somebody like Richard Perry who's seen so many different people,
Yeah.
like big stars record, but he's getting chills. He's seeing magic. There's just something about the Beatles that nothing can explain. And he
Yeah.
witnessed it firsthand. And he's one of very few people who could witness that.
Yeah. He might be the only one who could, around this time, who could say that.
Yeah, because there must have been something too, like you were at the session for, Hey Jude or whatever. Like the Beatles are a known quantity. Like it's
Yes.
magic, of course, but it's something you expect. If you go in and you do not expect three Beatles to be recording as part of your day,
Yeah.
3 years
I know.
after the Beatles started just massively fighting in public with each other, never think this was happening ever again. And this happens to you. You must be just floored. Like what a thing to see.
For sure. I mean, even working with one Beatle, I'm sure when Ringo called him up, he was like, "Oh, awesome. Yeah, let's do
Yeah.
this." And then, "Oh, John's gonna come. John's got this song. You're gonna record it. Holy shit. Yeah." And then it's like, George, like I'd be on the floor. It's like, you've got to be kidding me.
And it was a one-time thing. It was the only time when three of the former Beatles recorded together when all four of them were alive. The next time that this happened would be when Paul and Ringo collaborated with George on All Those Years Ago, which was, of course, his tribute to John after he was murdered. So one time only.
Hmm.
Now, the reaction to the song that probably followed Richard Perry's feelings about it was more about this Beatles connection than the song itself or even about Ringo. The original Rolling Stone interview of the album Ringo from Ben Gershon, he says, quote, on I Am the Greatest, the only cut on which any three of the four appear, a stunning alchemy occurs. The small matter of John's pungent, sardonic backup vocal and a Harrison guitar part which burns like gonorrhea energize this song beyond all explanation.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, gross, but you get the
It definitely
picture.
paints a picture. Yeah.
Yeah, gross. Alan Betrick's review in Phonograph Record was really like totally all about John, that the song signified John's songwriting comeback after the disaster that was sometime in New York City. And after that, he says, quote, the gum-chewing proverbial tongue-in-cheek rocker has returned with more of the old genius, and Ringo handles the song quite well.
I think that's very true. I think Ringo does. As much as we talk about this being such a landmark with the three Beatles, I think Ringo really deserves a lot of the credit here because the song is delivered in such a catchy way and his voice is really tailored to it. It is a Ringo song. John was very wise in a lot of ways for not recording it himself, but I think in giving it to Ringo, he really serviced the song in the best way.
Nobody else could have done it except Ringo, and nobody else
Yeah.
could have done it like Ringo. It's one of my favorite Ringo songs alongside, well, the No No song. I
Oh
fucking
my
love the
God.
No
Yeah.
No song.
Hell yeah. No, no song. No, no song all day long.
Love it so much.
I would love to fucking hear him do No No Song live, but I know that will never happen.
I don't know why.
I don't
Everybody would
know.
sing along. Everyone knows the No No song.
So good.
Now, the reviews, of course, focused so much on the Beatles collaboration aspect of it. And what do you know? It sparked rumors of a Beatles reunion. And this is so funny that that there were a lot of people chattering about this and proposing this new lineup where it would be John, George, Ringo, Klaus, and Billy. And they referred to this lineup as the Ladders.
Where did that name come from?
I don't know. I kept seeing it in the research that people called them that. And they didn't call themselves that. They didn't want a Beatles reunion.
I mean, still, I'd buy that ticket.
Oh, I'd totally buy that ticket. But we're forgetting about somebody here, I think.
Who could that be? Who
Yeah.
could that be?
There's still no mention of Paul in the
Oh,
Ladders.
him. Yeah.
Yeah, that guy who, sued them and whatever.
And whatever, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yada, yada, yada. 1973. Even though there was no Paul, Ringo later thought that had Paul been in LA at the time, he probably would have joined in. And maybe that's
Aw.
true.
Maybe.
If you look at the Toot and a Snore in 74, that was out of nowhere.
It's true, but but 73, obviously it's still very kind of touch and go there with all the Beatles. So 74 was like a whole different ball game. How much these guys packed into like individual years is
I know.
astounding. Yeah.
This was the time when like the lawsuits were just beginning to get settled. And I think they were all like, even John and Paul were talking to each other, like their friendship was slowly getting back on track, but they were adversaries still. They were
Yeah.
adversarial. So,
And I
you know.
think maybe Paul at this time would have seen this as more of a business thing rather
Mhm.
than a friendship thing, even if it's Ringo.
And I think he did because
Yeah.
Paul, obviously, we haven't talked about Paul. He was also on this record. That's what makes this the closest thing we ever had to a Beatles reunion. But Paul was a late addition to the record. Paul had asked Richard Perry to come to London to oversee some of his own recordings. And this was right after the I Am the Greatest recording session. And Perry was on a super high from that. Oh my God. And so he asked Paul if he would add something to that song so that all four of them were on it, like more now and then style after the
Mm.
fact. Paul said no, he didn't want to do that.
Damn it,
Fuck that.
Paul.
Nope. But he said he would write a song for Ringo for the album. He didn't have anything. And Richard said, "How soon can you have something?" And he said, "Give me a deadline." And Richard Perry said Wednesday. And on Wednesday, he delivered the song 6 o'clock. So he did
Well,
it.
damn. I
Yeah.
mean, give Paul a deadline, see what he can come up with.
Unfortunately, though, Paul and Linda were banned from traveling to the US at that moment, thanks to a drug charge that was giving them some visa troubles. So Paul said, "Let's have it in the UK. And if it's in the UK, I'll come." So Ringo went to them, as did Richard Perry. And soon after the session with John and George, Ringo was in England recording 6 o'clock at the Apple Studios of all places. That song has Ringo on drums and on lead vocals, Paul on piano and synth. He and Linda also sang backing vocals. Klaus Foreman is on bass. And Vince Poncha, Ringo's co writer throughout much of the 70s, who also has some songwriting credits on the Ringo album, he played acoustic guitar and some additional percussion. Paul also added a second contribution to the Ringo album. He added an odd solo to Ringo's other huge hit from this album, which is a cover version of the very problematic song You're 16. And he did a solo part that kind of sounded like a kazoo. It was actually his mouth. I don't know. I mean, to me, that's like on the
It
level with
sounds
like chewing celery for the Beach Boys. Like it's just, whatever.
Yeah, I know. It's so unbelievable that it's not a kazoo. Yeah, definitely. I went back and listened to it a couple of times since learning this fun fact, and it still like stymies me because it's not only sounds like a kazoo, but it also sounds like Ringo at the end singing. So,
Oh,
unless Paul's doing his best Ringo impression.
Paul actually said he meant for it to sound more like a jazz sax or something. Like he didn't mean kazoo, but it ended up,
Interesting.
yeah, reading as kazoo. So that's
Okay.
where we
Well,
were on that.
yeah, he went for jazz sax and landed somewhere around kazoo.
Yeah. So in total, 10 songs in the album, the Beatles were involved one way or another on 6 out of those 10 tracks. Just quickly, the other 4 tracks are Have You Seen My Baby, a Randy Newman song that Randy Newman released on one of his own albums in 1970. Oh My by Ringo and Vince Poncha, the third single from this album. Also, not as big of a success as like Photograph, but
Fucking
certainly,
love that song.
yeah, a big one on Ringo's catalog. Step Lightly by Ringo, which featured him actually tap dancing in the song.
So charming.
And finally, Devil Woman, another Ringo and Vince Poncha track.
Yeah, I don't know. I vacillate whether this song is problematic or not, but I do not like hearing Ringo say the only way I'll get you is to get you in bed or whatever he said. I don't like that for Ringo.
Yeah, him saying I'm the greatest is really fun. Him saying like I'll get you in bed is like inauthentic.
Yeah, it's like no, that's not Ringo. You're not that. It's okay. You don't have to be that.
No, John should have been involved in cleaning up the song a little bit, and it would have been more right for Ringo.
Yeah, there we go.
Mm-hmm.
Get John
Yeah.
involved. Have George write that damn bridge.
Yeah, no shit. Put some guitar on it. Got it. So, critical reaction, very similar to I'm the Greatest. reflected more the Beatles' contribution and the wonder of Beatles collaboration than anything else. But for Ringo, the album hit #1 in Canada, #7 in the UK, #2 in the Billboard charts, his highest ever ranking there. The next year, Goodnight Vienna would land in the top 10. The 3 singles that they released from this album all peaked in Billboard's top 10. Photograph was #1. You're 16 was also #1. And Oh My hit #5.
That's pretty decent.
He was killing it. He was killing
Yeah.
it. Not to mention that his first 2 rock singles were also fantastic successes.
All I can think right now, which is so bad, is that Paul's just watching this being like, hold my beer, drop a Ben on the run.
Yeah, heading off to Lagos for a bit. Be right back.
Yeah, it's like Ringo's like, man, I can't even have a moment with all my #1 singles and top 10 album.
I know.
Yeah,
Paul doesn't
BRB heading to Lagos.
Paul doesn't mean to be such a genius. It just happens.
Oh, now you're being an apologist
I can't
on
help it.
our Ringo episode.
I know. Okay. Sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. You can't help. You can't help it.
I
You
can't help
the way
it.
you are.
So on November 25th, 1973, in the New York Times, Lorraine Alterman called the album a powerhouse and an instant knockout. And, ooh, sorry, John, she compared it to Mind Games.
Yikes.
And which was out just the same time. But man, though, the Beatles, like all 4 of them were going crazy in 1973. Jesus. She originally wrote off Mind Games as simplistic, but said it grew on her and called it eventually a fascinating piece of work. But she calls Oh My the rock song of 1973.
That's high praise.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, all these Beatles solo hits, all the other bands, the rock song of 1973.
It kind of is interesting because it's not the most hard rocking thing. And this is when you have like, I'm thinking about like Led Zeppelin coming into play here, all of the sort of like harder edge stuff. But Oh My by Ringo Starr, the rock song of 1973. That's a mic drop. Yeah.
Yeah. Ben Garson's review in Rolling Stone, he said that the album is, quote, a homecoming of sorts for Ringo and the other 3 Beatles. He also calls Ringo the most successful album of any of the 3 Beatles up to this point. He says, quote, it's not polemical and abrasive like Lennon's, harsh and self-pitying like Harrison's, or precious and flimsy like McCartney's, but balanced, airy, and amiable.
Kind of like what Ringo was in the Beatles, right? He wasn't polarizing like the other 3 could be at times.
What he's doing in this review, and I don't think that this is true, but he's taking each of their worst character flaws that we know about and overlaying them on their solo careers. Balanced, airy, and amiable is not only what Ringo was, but what the balance of the 4 Beatles did with one another. So
interesting.
In a way, he's kind of saying it's like a Beatles album. Like it feels like a Beatles album.
It feels like a
whereas
Beatles album, yeah.
other solo albums feel like the worst parts of these other 3 people.
Well, it's like any sort of equation. When you take a piece of that out, then that piece is just, it's self-amplified, right?
Right.
So it's like within the Beatles, of course, you've got Lennon balancing McCartney, for example, but, divided, they're just themselves, but like a more, amplified version of that.
Right. And in this review, he doesn't say anything about Ringo's former efforts. He's only talking about this album. But, of course, Ringo probably indulges his maybe character flaws or flaws as a musician in his first 2 albums by doing novelty pieces. So it does balance all 4 of them out. And being Ringo's album, it's most forward with like these positive characteristics that are Ringo's. But it is because of the balance of the 4 Beatles, I think, that make it feel that way.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And I think also that the transition stage of the Beatles is reflected in the album and in the music. On one side, we have John, George, and Ringo, who were united against Paul during the Alan Klein debacle. And because of that, they always were in each other's orbits in some form, however casual or infrequent. And the songs they collaborate on here show it. They're all more tailored to Ringo. Some are written with Ringo. They feel personal, especially, I think, You and Me, Babe, which gives Ringo time to literally thank people who contributed to the record and gets him to, indulge his lounge lizard tendencies again, which is always fun. And I Am the Greatest, especially, is totally autobiographical. And John knows exactly how to walk that line between parody and truth for Ringo. And the song, of course, more than everything else, got Beatle magic thanks to that live collaboration. There's something about what all three of them brought that it just made it different. Like Richard Perry had experienced, it was just a totally different beast once three of them got in the room together.
And I think it's something that comes across on the record too, because
Yeah.
that song definitely has like an electric feel that really sparks that record. And so that makes it the perfect opener for this record. Right out of the gate, it's like, damn, this is going to be a great, kind of whets the palate. And, and Ringo, the album, crazily enough, doesn't disappoint. Like, that's not like it starts off strong and then it just all goes to hell. It's like, that's the perfect opener for this album.
Yeah, it's truly a warm-up act for everything else.
Yeah.
It makes you excited about the rest of the album. And then we have Paul's collaboration with Ringo, which I think also really shows the moment of transition that they were in. I mean, 6 O'Clock is a lovely song. It's suited to Ringo's vocal range. Paul did write it for Ringo in a couple of days on that deadline. But other than that, there's not real personalization in it. It could be any Wings album, everything, the piano, the backing vocals, Linda's presence in the backing vocals, the orchestration, it's pure fucking Paul. And it's almost like what we get on the Ringo album is Paul's desire to be part of the thing, but only on his own well-controlled terms,
Yeah.
And it almost makes sense if you think about Paul's position at the time. Like, I'm totally going to be an apologist right now. Paul was the one in 1 against 3 in the Alan Klein scenario. And that sucks, And I think that in the same way that he's said some pretty callous things when loved ones had passed away, and he's had those moments, I think he deals with those things by shutting it out.
Mm.
And, first he drank himself into a stupor in Scotland after the first blow of the breakup hit him. And then once Linda helped him out of that, he opened back up to music, but not to people. I mean, he recorded the McCartney album with absolutely zero involvement from any person other than Linda. He actually considered calling the album, quote, "I'm the one it hit the most," in reference to the Beatles breakup. Like,
intense.
Yeah. I mean, that goes really far to completely block out everybody and to make a whole album. Luckily, he's just a genius and he can do that, but it's still crazy.
Mm.
And then once he felt more ready to be in the world again, he still blocked the Beatles out of his life. He started over musically. He played absolutely no Beatles songs in the beginning of his solo career. And he went so far to anonymously play like university campuses and pubs and stuff when Wings first started, like he was some unknown bar band. Like, he did not want to associate himself to the extent that he could. So it kind of makes me feel that Paul, he was the one that got shut out. And whether it was correct or not, like, who knows whether Lee Eastman was the right choice for that manager role. But he probably didn't feel all that creatively free with them yet. The first time anybody is reaching out to him in 3 years to collaborate on anything.
I think that's really fascinating in this because Paul could have easily just sort of like contributed his kazoo, whatever solo, and been sort of anonymous, on the album. And we could still be talking today, like, oh, is that Paul? Is that not Paul?
Mm-hmm.
But he wrote a whole song, like a whole ass song, and gave it to Ringo. Like, that's pretty significant, I think, for Paul to kind of do that at this point, at this juncture, when again, he could have just sort of slipped in there unnoticed and done something for Ringo, and it could have still been on Paul's terms, but it would have been, like a little bit more low key.
On the other side of the coin, he was asked, "Will you contribute to I'm the Greatest?" And he's like, "Hell no, I will not do that. I will not go that far."
Do you think it's because he probably had bigger beef with John and George?
Yeah, I don't think it was Ringo. I think that when he was not ready to be in that type of collaboration yet, especially like on a record. And also, regardless of his immigration status and all that, like he couldn't come to the country. It does sound from the stories like he was asked about contributing after that happened. I don't know if he was an afterthought. I don't think he was in Ringo's mind, but I wonder if maybe Ringo wasn't all that excited about like approaching Paul with this.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
totally possible. I mean, it may have been a little bit of apprehension.
Ringo did have George and John in his orbit. He must have had some interaction with Paul. I can't imagine that him coming to Apple Studios to record that song was like the first time they had interaction since Paul wanted to like punch him in the face when he delivered that letter or whatever. But who knows what the extent of it was and
Yeah,
how Ringo even felt about it. I mean, Ringo's a pretty laid back guy, but it does sound like that moment really shook him.
for sure, which is totally understandable. It's so interesting, yeah, to think about just where everybody was personally, during this time. And you're right, Paul being the odd one out, like that must have really fucked with his head.
Yeah, and
And
the
yeah,
whole Lee Eastman thing is interesting because it's not like he just wanted a different person as a manager. He wanted his father-in-law as the manager. It was so insular. You know, he had Linda and the whole Eastman clan fiercely on his side. But as much as that was amazing support for him and probably what he did need at the time, it also made him into a faction. Like you can't negotiate if that's the side you're
you
on.
can't
And those,
negotiate with family like that.
yeah, there's nothing
Yeah.
you can do. So I think he was fine with digging in his heels on that. You know, I don't think that he was forced to do it in any way, but had he wanted to have the choice, I don't know if he could have either. But after Alan Klein was finally booted from the Beatles' orbit, and it took them a while, but finally, Paul was much more ready to come out and publicly rekindle a friendship with them. Paul told the BBC in April of that year, just after they had recorded 6 o'clock, he said, "Now Klein's gone out, the main obstacle to people working together has been removed. It doesn't mean necessarily the Beatles are going to reform. It might mean that I'll play a concert in New York with John somewhere, and George might roll in, and Ringo might roll in, and you find that the Beatles are on stage kind of thing. But at the moment, there's no great plan to get back together."
Hmm.
So he was thinking about it in totally friendly ways, you know?
It's funny, and I'm totally nitpicking Paul here, but it's funny that he frames it as I'm having the concert and John might show up, George might show up, Ringo might show up, but it's my concert. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that
It
funny?
is. It is.
Yeah.
It is.
It's such a Paul thing to say.
Yeah. And even if he means that he and John are playing like as a duo, it still means John and Paul and George and Ringo.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
They did eventually become much closer. And while the only additional musical collaboration it resulted in was the Toot and a Snore in 74 session, which is bootlegged and you can find it everywhere, I think that the only reason that that was the only thing was because of John's untimely death. All signs were pointing to this increased closeness in the future with all four of them. I mean, Paul and Linda were visiting John and May in 74. They were calling each other on the phone. All signs were pointing to this increased openness to collaborations in the future with all four of them, especially if the events of the movie Two of Us are even partially true,
And of course, we bring it back to two of us.
as it should be.
Oh,
Hmm.
I love that we even end a Ringo episode with two of us.
I mean, that's what Paul would have done.
That's true. It's true. And again, ending a Ringo episode with something Paul would have done. That's apt. Thank you for telling us all about Ringo.
That was really fun to explore this and fun to learn more about my favorite Ringo album. And this time of the Beatles, mid 70s, 73, 74, is such a fascinating time.
It really is. We've been doing so much 70s stuff. It's been fun to like live in that space
Yeah.
because we rarely have done that before. We're obviously mostly in the 60s with the Beatles. So the 70s has been really fun to sort of like experience through May. And we're going to get into Mind Games shortly, which would be really fun. And the
Yeah.
Ringo album.
And one hand clapping. Don't forget
One
about
hand
Paul.
clapping. Now we just need to go to the concert for Bangladesh with George, and we'll
Yes.
be completing our 70s run.
Yeah, so Mind Games coming up next. Then we'll hit some George. Maybe we'll top it out with a Toot and a Snore in 74 just for
We're
fun.
thinking about it. Yeah, we're thinking about some more 70s topics for you guys. So, and then of course we've got some big 60s anniversaries coming up. Lots to
Yeah.
talk about.
Yeah, it continues to be a big Beatles year, and when isn't it?
Yes, I know. These guys keep us busy.
They do. So happy birthday to Ringo. Many, many more. And thanks so much for listening to BC the Beatles. As always, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. And give us a rating and review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. And remember, you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com too. And we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.